Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the Battles of Narvik, a series of remarkable military engagements that unfolded in the remote northern reaches of Norway between April 9th and June 8th, 1940. Settle in comfortably as we journey back through time to explore these pivotal confrontations that took place against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, deep fjords, and the midnight sun of the Arctic Circle. To understand the battles of Narvik, we must first transport ourselves to the early spring of 1940, a time when the world was still adjusting to the reality of the Second World War. The conflict that would eventually engulf the entire globe was, in those early months, still finding its shape and character. The period that would later be called the Phony War was coming to an end, and the nations of Europe were about to discover just how dramatically modern warfare could reshape borders, alliances, and destinies. Narvik itself is a town that sits far above the Arctic Circle, nestled in the Ofotfjord in northern Norway. It is a place where nature displays itself in its most dramatic forms, where mountains rise sharply from the sea, their peaks often shrouded in clouds, their slopes covered in snow for much of the year. The fjord waters are deep and dark, reflecting the ever-changing Arctic sky. In April, this region experiences the transition from the long polar night toward the period of the midnight sun, creating an otherworldly quality to the light that bathes the landscape. The town itself, though remote, held significance far beyond its modest size. Narvik was and remains a crucial port, one of the few in the region that remains ice-free year-round, thanks to the warming influence of the North Atlantic Current. This geographical blessing made it the perfect terminus for a railway line that stretched inland to the iron ore mines of northern Sweden. These mines, particularly those around Kiruna and Gällivare, produced some of the highest quality iron ore in the world, a resource that had become absolutely vital to the industrial war machines of the great powers. As winter turned to spring in 1940, the iron ore that flowed through Narvik had become a strategic prize of immense importance. Germany's war industry depended heavily on Swedish iron ore, millions of tons of it each year. During the winter months, when the Gulf of Bothnia froze and Swedish ports on the Baltic Sea became inaccessible, virtually all of this ore had to travel by rail to Narvik, then be shipped by sea down the Norwegian coast to German ports. For Britain and France, interdicting this iron ore supply had become a strategic objective. They reasoned quite logically that choking off Germany's access to Swedish ore could significantly hamper the Nazi war effort. For Germany, protecting this supply line was equally imperative. The German High Command understood that losing access to Swedish iron ore could prove catastrophic to their military ambitions. Norway, for its part, wished only to maintain its neutrality. The Norwegian people had no desire to be drawn into the great conflict consuming Europe. They had maintained their independence and neutrality through the First World War, and they hoped to do so again. But the geographic reality of their long coastline and their proximity to vital resources made such neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. The strategic calculations surrounding Scandinavia had been influenced by events in neighboring Finland. The Soviet Union had invaded Finland in late November 1939, beginning what would become known as the Winter War. The world watched with fascination as Finnish forces, though vastly outnumbered, mounted a remarkably effective defense against the Soviet invasion. This conflict had brought Scandinavia into sharp focus for all the major powers. Britain and France had actually considered sending an expeditionary force through Norway and Sweden to aid Finland, though the true strategic aim of such a force would have included securing the iron ore fields and cutting Germany's supply line. These plans never came to fruition, partly due to Norwegian and Swedish unwillingness to allow foreign troops passage through their territory, and partly because the Winter War ended in March 1940 before such plans could be executed. But the planning that had been done and the forces that had been prepared would not go to waste. The British and French high commands had become intimately familiar with the geography of northern Scandinavia and had made detailed preparations for operations in the region. Similarly, German military planners had observed these Allied preparations with growing alarm, recognizing that their iron ore supply line was vulnerable to Allied action. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler and his military commanders made a momentous decision. Rather than wait for the Allies to potentially move against Norway and threaten the ore supply, Germany would strike first. The operation that would come to be known as Weserübung, Weser exercise, named after a river in Germany, was conceived as a bold, simultaneous invasion of both Denmark and Norway. The planning for this operation was extraordinarily complex. Norway's coastline stretches for thousands of kilometers, punctuated by countless fjords, islands, and inlets. The Germans would need to capture multiple key ports simultaneously, from Oslo in the south to Narvik in the far north, a distance of over 1,500 kilometers as the crow flies and much farther by sea. They would need to do this while the Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force in the world, maintained control of the surrounding seas. The boldness of the plan cannot be overstated. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, was vastly inferior to the Royal Navy in terms of size and firepower. The operation would require the Germans to commit nearly their entire surface fleet, knowing that losses would be catastrophic to their already limited naval strength. Yet Hitler and his commanders, particularly Admiral Erich Raeder, believed that speed, surprise, and audacity could overcome these disadvantages. For the assault on Narvik specifically, the Germans assembled a force of 10 modern destroyers, representing a significant portion of their destroyer fleet. These warships would carry mountain troops specially trained for Arctic warfare, the 139th Mountain Regiment and other elements of the 3rd Mountain Division, under the command of General Eduard Dietl. These soldiers, many of whom were Austrian and had experience in alpine environments, would be tasked with capturing and holding Narvik and the vital ore railway. The morning of April 9, 1940 dawned across Norway with news that would shatter the nation's peaceful existence. German forces had struck at multiple points along the coast, from Kristiansand in the south to Narvik in the north. The carefully maintained neutrality of Norway had been violated in the most comprehensive manner imaginable. In Narvik, the inhabitants awoke to an extraordinary sight. Through the pre-dawn darkness and snow squalls, 10 German destroyers had navigated the narrow fjord approaches to the harbor. These powerful warships, led by the destroyer Wilhelm Heidkamp, flying the pennant of Commodore Friedrich Bonte, had penetrated deep into what the Norwegians had considered safe territorial waters. The Norwegian garrison at Narvik was modest, consisting of a few companies of infantry and the defenses at the coastal batteries. The Norwegian Navy had two elderly coastal defense ships in the area, the Norge and the Eidsvold, vessels that had been built in the early 1900s and were thoroughly outclassed by modern warships, but which represented Norway's determination to defend its neutrality. As the German destroyers approached through the swirling snow, the Eidsvold, under the command of Captain Odd Isaacson Willoch, moved to intercept. In the pre-dawn gloom, a boat was dispatched from the German destroyer Heidkamp, carrying an officer to deliver an ultimatum: surrender the port or face attack. Captain Willoch refused. He was, after all, a naval officer sworn to defend his nation's sovereignty, and despite the hopeless odds, he would not simply surrender without a fight. What happened next was both tragic and inevitable. The German destroyers opened fire at point-blank range. Torpedoes struck the Eidsvold, and the old coastal defense ship, never designed to withstand such modern weapons, was torn apart by massive explosions. She sank within minutes, taking most of her crew of 175 men with her. It was a devastating loss, a shocking introduction to the brutal reality of modern naval warfare. The Norge, sister ship to the Eidsvold, attempted to engage but faced the same impossible odds. She too was torpedoed and sank rapidly, taking 101 of her crew to the bottom of the fjord. In a matter of minutes, Norway's naval presence in the north had been eliminated, and German mountain troops were coming ashore in Narvik. The town itself was captured with relatively little resistance. The Norwegian garrison was simply too small and too surprised to mount an effective defense against a force of over 2,000 German mountain troops. By mid-morning, the Nazi flag flew over Narvik, and German forces had secured the ore railway facilities, the primary objective of their daring operation. But if the Germans thought their bold stroke had secured Narvik permanently, they were soon to be rudely awakened. The Royal Navy, which had been caught somewhat by surprise by the scope and speed of the German invasion of Norway, was already preparing its response. And in command of one of the destroyer flotillas that would deliver that response was a captain named Bernard Warburton Lee, an officer who would soon demonstrate the kind of aggressive spirit that had made the Royal Navy the dominant naval force it was. Captain Warburton Lee, commanding the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla from his flagship HMS Hardy, had been patrolling off the coast when news of the German invasion reached him. His orders from the Admiralty were to proceed to Narvik and, if conditions permitted, to recapture the port or at least prevent its use by the Germans. The orders concluded with the phrase, "Use your own discretion," words that gave Warburton Lee the freedom to act as he saw fit based on local conditions. As he approached Narvik through the narrow fjords on the evening of April 9th, Warburton Lee gathered intelligence about the German forces. Reports from Norwegian pilots suggested that at least 6 German destroyers were in the harbor, along with various merchant vessels. What these reports couldn't reveal, was that there were actually 10 German destroyers in the area, with some having moved to nearby Herjungsfjorden to refuel from a German tanker. In the early hours of April 10th, in the half-light of the Arctic dawn, Warburton Lee led his 5 destroyers, Hardy, Hunter, Havoc, Hotspur, and Hostile, into Ofotfjorden and toward Narvik. The plan was simple and audacious. Attack the German destroyers at anchor, sink as many as possible, and withdraw before the Germans could mount an effective response. The British destroyers crept through the fjord in line astern, maintaining silence, their crews at action stations. The landscape around them was stark and beautiful, high mountains rising on either side, their slopes still deep in snow. The water of the fjord dark and still. As they rounded the last bend before Narvik, the German ships came into view. Warburton Lee's force achieved complete tactical surprise. At 4:30 a.m., the British destroyers opened fire. Torpedoes leapt from their tubes, streaking through the dark water toward the anchored German destroyers. Shells from the British guns arced across the harbor. The first that many of the German sailors knew of the attack was the sound of explosions and the shock of torpedoes striking home. The Wilhelm Heidkamp, Commodore Bonte's flagship, was hit by a torpedo from HMS Hardy. The explosion was catastrophic, detonating the destroyer's magazine. The ship was torn apart and sank almost immediately, taking Commodore Bonte and most of the crew with her. The Anton Schmidt was also struck by torpedoes and began to sink. The Dieter von Roeder was damaged and the Hans Ludemann was hit and left in a sinking condition, though she would later be beached. For the British, it was a moment of extraordinary success. They had penetrated a defended enemy harbor and struck a devastating blow against German naval forces. But Warburton Lee was not finished. His destroyers moved deeper into the harbor, engaging German merchant ships that had been carrying supplies for the invasion force. Several of these were sunk or set ablaze, adding to the chaos and destruction in Narvik harbor. But then, as the British destroyers began their withdrawal, the situation changed dramatically. The German destroyers that had been refueling in Herjungsfjorden, having heard the sounds of battle, were rushing to join the fight. 5 German destroyers, Georg Thiele, Bernd von Arnim, Erich Giese, Erich Köllner, and Wolfgang Senker, came racing down the fjord to intercept the withdrawing British force. What followed was a running battle through the narrow confines of the fjord system, a confused and desperate engagement where visibility was limited by snow squalls, and the geometry of the narrow waterway prevented sophisticated tactical maneuvers. It was essentially a gun battle at relatively close range, with destroyers from both sides trading salvos as they maneuvered through the constrained waters. HMS Hardy, in the lead of the British line, found herself engaged by multiple German destroyers. Shells struck her bridge, killing Captain Warburton Lee and several of his officers. Severely damaged and with her commanding officer dead, Hardy was run aground to prevent her from sinking in deep water. The survivors would eventually make it to shore and evade capture, beginning a remarkable journey through the Norwegian wilderness. HMS Hunter was also hit repeatedly and severely damaged. Unable to maneuver properly, she collided with HMS Hotspur and was then struck by more German shells. She sank with significant loss of life, adding to the human cost of this fierce engagement. But the British destroyers were giving as good as they got. The German destroyer Erich Köllner was heavily damaged by gunfire. More significantly, as the battle moved out of the fjord system and into more open water, the British destroyers encountered the German ammunition ship Rauenfels and sank her, a loss that would later prove significant as the German destroyers in Narvik ran short of ammunition. The First Battle of Narvik, as it would come to be known, ended with both sides having suffered significant losses. The Germans had lost 2 destroyers sunk outright and had 3 others damaged, and they had lost their senior naval commander in Narvik. The British had lost 2 destroyers and had 3 others damaged to varying degrees, and they had lost a courageous and capable commander in Captain Warburton Lee, who would posthumously be awarded the Victoria Cross for his leadership and bravery. The First Battle of Narvik had been a tactical draw of sorts, but strategically it had revealed the vulnerability of the German forces in Narvik. The 8 remaining German destroyers were now trapped in the fjord system, running low on fuel and ammunition, and cut off from any realistic possibility of reinforcement or escape. The Royal Navy, recognizing this opportunity, began assembling a more powerful force to finish what Warburton Lee had started. Command of this operation was given to Vice Admiral William Jock Whitworth, flying his flag in the battleship HMS Warspite. The Warspite was one of the grand old ladies of the Royal Navy, having fought at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Recently modernized, she carried 8 15-inch guns that could fire a shell weighing nearly a ton to a range of over 20 miles. Accompanying her would be 9 destroyers from various flotillas, a force that significantly outgunned the trapped German destroyers. On April 13th, Whitworth's force entered the Ofotfjord and began the methodical destruction of the German destroyer flotilla. The Germans, recognizing that they faced impossible odds, fought with desperate courage. Their situation was hopeless, low on fuel and ammunition, trapped in a confined space facing a battleship and a superior force of destroyers, but they would not surrender without a fight. The British force advanced up the fjord in a deliberate manner, with destroyers screening ahead of the Warspite. The battleship's presence was psychologically devastating to the Germans. The sight of that massive warship, with her huge guns capable of destroying a destroyer with a single hit, making its way up the fjord, was a stark reminder of just how untenable the German position had become. One of the remarkable moments of this battle involved the Warspite's Swordfish float plane. This biplane, catapulted from the battleship to provide aerial reconnaissance, spotted a German submarine, U-64, lurking in Herjungsfjorden. The pilot attacked with anti-submarine bombs and succeeded in sinking the U-boat, the first ever sinking of a submarine by aircraft launched from a battleship. It was a harbinger of the future of naval warfare, where aircraft would play an increasingly dominant role. The German destroyers, knowing they faced destruction or capture, fought with remarkable tenacity. The Erich Kölner and the Erich Giese engaged the British destroyers in fierce gun battles before being overwhelmed and sunk. The Dieter von Röder, already damaged in the first battle, was finished off. The Wolfgang Zanker and the Bernd von Arnim fought until they exhausted their ammunition before being scuttled by their crews. The Georg Thiele, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Max Eckhart Wolf, made a desperate run toward the end of Rombaksfjorden, a narrow branch of the Ofotfjorden. pursued by British destroyers and with the Warspite's great guns sending shells crashing around her, the Georg Thiele fought to the last. When her ammunition was finally exhausted and she had been hit repeatedly, Wolfe ordered her to be run aground and scuttled. The crew abandoned ship and made their way ashore to join the German mountain troops fighting in the hills around Narvik. The Hans Ludemann, which had been beached after the first battle, was found by the British and completely destroyed by shell fire. By the end of the day, on April 13th, the entire German destroyer flotilla that had brought the mountain troops to Narvik had been eliminated. Not a single German destroyer escaped. All 10 had been either sunk or scuttled. The Second Battle of Narvik was a complete tactical victory for the Royal Navy. They had destroyed an entire enemy destroyer flotilla at the cost of minimal damage to their own ships. Only 2 destroyers suffered significant damage, and casualties were relatively light. It was a demonstration of naval power and a reminder of why the Royal Navy was considered the most formidable naval force in the world. But the destruction of the German destroyer flotilla, while a significant tactical victory, did not solve the fundamental strategic problem. German mountain troops still held Narvik and the vital ore railway. General Dietl and his approximately 2,000 mountain troops, now reinforced by the surviving crews from the destroyed destroyers, several hundred additional men with naval training but little ground combat experience, were digging in around the town and in the surrounding mountains. The situation Dietl faced was extraordinarily difficult. His forces were isolated, cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply by sea. They had limited heavy weapons, no armor, and were outnumbered by the Norwegian forces in the region. Moreover, the British and French were now preparing to land an expeditionary force to recapture Narvik and more broadly to assist Norway in resisting the German invasion. Yet Dietl had certain advantages. His mountain troops were among the best trained soldiers in the German military, specialists in Alpine and Arctic warfare. The terrain around Narvik, rugged mountains, deep snow, limited roads, favored the defense. And perhaps most importantly, Hitler had made it clear that Narvik must be held at all costs. The Führer, in one of his increasingly common interventions in military matters, declared that Narvik was to be defended to the last man if necessary. For the Norwegians, the situation was complex. The government had fled Oslo as German forces advanced, and they were now attempting to organize resistance from various locations in the north and west of the country. Norwegian forces in the Narvik area, under the command of General Carl Gustav Fleischer, were determined to recapture the town. Fleischer was a capable and energetic commander who understood both the strategic importance of Narvik and the symbolic importance of showing that Norway would resist the invasion. The Norwegian 6th Division, which Fleischer commanded, was mobilizing in the rugged terrain around Narvik. These were men who knew the land, who had grown up in these northern regions, who understood how to move and fight in deep snow and bitter cold. While they lacked heavy weapons and their equipment was often outdated, they had motivation and local knowledge on their side. In Britain and France, military planners were hastily preparing an expeditionary force to land in Norway. The campaign would initially focus on several objectives: supporting Norwegian resistance, recapturing key ports and particularly in the north, retaking Narvik and cutting off the German access to Swedish iron ore. The force assembled for operations around Narvik was substantial. It would eventually include British, French, and Polish troops, a truly multinational effort. The French contributed several battalions of chasseurs alpins, elite mountain troops comparable to the German mountain troops in training and equipment. The Polish government in exile contributed a Highland brigade of Polish troops, men who had escaped Poland after the German invasion in September 1939 and were eager to strike back at their conquerors. British forces included various infantry brigades, including territorial army units and units of the Scots and Irish Guards. These were capable soldiers, but most had limited experience with Arctic conditions or mountain warfare. The assumption was that naval gunfire support from Royal Navy ships offshore would compensate for any deficiencies in ground forces. The Allied plan was to land forces at several points around Narvik, gradually encircle the German positions, and then assault the town itself. It seemed straightforward on paper, but the reality of operations in this remote, harsh environment would prove far more challenging than anticipated. As April progressed into May, the campaign around Narvik settled into a pattern that would have been familiar to soldiers from any mountain warfare campaign. The fighting was characterized by small unit actions in difficult terrain, by the challenges of moving troops and supplies through deep snow and over mountain passes, by the difficulty of coordinating attacks when communications were often unreliable and when the terrain prevented units from easily supporting each other. The Norwegian forces operating from the landward side of Narvik pushed toward the town from the east and northeast. General Fleischer's troops fought a series of engagements with German forces in the mountains, gradually forcing them back toward Narvik. The Norwegians had the advantage of local knowledge and of troops who were accustomed to the environment, but they lacked heavy weapons and were chronically short of ammunition and supplies. The first major Allied landing took place at Harstad, a town on a large island northwest of Narvik, on April 15th. This became the main base for Allied operations, a staging area where troops could be landed, organized, and supplied before being moved forward to the fighting fronts. Harstad was far enough from Narvik to be out of reach of German ground forces, but close enough to serve as an effective base of operations. However, the Allies soon discovered the challenges of operating in this environment. The port facilities at Harstad were limited. The weather was often atrocious, with snow squalls and strong winds making naval operations difficult and sometimes impossible. The lack of roads meant that moving supplies and troops required either ships, which were vulnerable to German air attack, or difficult overland movements through terrain that was barely passable. Moreover, German air superiority began to make itself felt. The Luftwaffe, operating from airfields in Norway that were closer to Narvik than any Allied airfields, conducted regular bombing and strafing attacks on Allied ships and shore installations. The Allies had no aircraft carriers in the area initially and no nearby land bases from which to operate fighters, which meant that Luftwaffe aircraft could attack with relative impunity. One of the most significant German air attacks occurred on May 2nd, when Luftwaffe bombers attacked Allied shipping in the Narvik area. Several transports were damaged, and the destruction of supplies complicated the Allied buildup. This was a taste of what was to come in the campaign, as German air power would remain a constant threat throughout the operation. As May progressed, the Allies finally began their ground offensive in earnest. One of the first major engagements was the assault on Björkvik, a small village on the shore of Herjungsfjorden, north of Narvik. The Germans had established defensive positions in and around Björkvik, and capturing it was necessary to open another avenue of advance toward Narvik itself. The assault on Björkvik on May 13th was the first major amphibious operation of the campaign. French Foreign Legion troops supported by British and Norwegian forces would conduct a landing directly into Björkvik while other Allied forces attacked from the land side. The operation would be supported by heavy naval gunfire from British and French warships offshore. In the hours before dawn on May 13th, the Allied forces prepared for the assault. French Foreign Legionnaires, tough professional soldiers from one of France's most elite units, checked their weapons and equipment one final time. These men were veterans of colonial campaigns in Africa and Asia. Men who had fought in deserts and jungles, and now they would fight in the Arctic. The assault began with a thunderous naval bombardment. British and French warships, including cruisers and destroyers, pounded the German positions around Björkvik with hundreds of shells. The sound echoed off the mountains surrounding the fjord, and fires broke out in the village. The German defenders, mostly mountain troops from General Dietl's command, huddled in their fortifications and waited for the bombardment to lift. As the first light of dawn illuminated the scene, landing craft carrying the Foreign Legion troops approached the shore. German machine guns opened fire and small arms fire crackled across the water. But the weight of Allied firepower was overwhelming. The French troops stormed ashore, established a beachhead, and began fighting their way into the village. The fighting in Björkvik was intense but relatively brief. The German defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought stubbornly but were gradually overwhelmed. By the evening of May 13th, Björkvik was in Allied hands. The Germans had been pushed back, and the Allies had established another foothold closer to Narvik. The battle for Björkvik demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the Allied position. When they could bring their superior naval firepower to bear, and when they had the time to properly plan and coordinate an operation, they could achieve significant local successes. However, the operation had taken weeks to prepare, and even with overwhelming firepower, progress was measured in kilometers. While the campaign around Narvik was gradually moving in favor of the Allies, the broader strategic situation was changing dramatically. On May 10th, Germany had launched its long-awaited offensive in the west, Fall Gelb or Case Yellow. German armored columns had smashed through the Ardennes forest and were racing across France, outflanking the Maginot Line and threatening to cut off the British Expeditionary Force and the best of the French army in Belgium. News of the German breakthrough in France had profound implications for the campaign in Norway. The French and British governments, suddenly faced with an existential crisis on their home front, began to question whether they could afford to keep forces tied up in a secondary campaign in Norway. No matter how strategically important Narvik's iron ore might be. By late May, the situation in France had become catastrophic. The British Expeditionary Force was being forced back toward the English Channel, where the evacuation from Dunkirk would soon begin. The French army, despite fierce resistance in many sectors, was being torn apart by German armored spearheads. It became increasingly clear that the forces in Norway would be needed elsewhere. The orders from London and Paris were stark. Prepare to evacuate Norway. The campaign that had been launched with such high hopes just weeks earlier would have to be abandoned. But first, the Allies wanted one last success in Norway, one bright spot in a sea of disasters. They wanted to recapture Narvik. In the last days of May, the Allies prepared for the final assault on Narvik. By now, they had assembled overwhelming forces around the town. Norwegian troops had pushed down from the north and east. French and Polish troops had landed and were advancing from the west. British forces were in support. The German garrison, now numbering perhaps 5,000 men, including the remnants of destroyer crews and various support personnel, was outnumbered more than 4-1. General Dietl's position was desperate. His forces were running low on ammunition. They had been bombed and shelled daily for weeks. They were exhausted from constant combat and the harsh conditions, and they knew that massive Allied forces were converging on them. Yet Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Hold Narvik at all costs. On the night of May 27th to 28th, the final assault began. Norwegian forces, who had fought longest and hardest for this moment, attacked from the north and east. French and Polish forces assaulted from the west, crossing the Ofotfjord under cover of darkness. The Allied plan was to converge on Narvik from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing the Germans from concentrating their defense at any one point. The fighting was fierce. German mountain troops, despite their desperate situation, fought with the skill and tenacity for which they were renowned. Machine gun positions swept the approaches to the town. Mortars dropped shells onto advancing Allied troops. Every building became a potential strong point. But the weight of numbers and firepower was inexorable. Norwegian ski troops, many of them local men fighting to reclaim their own country, pushed into the outskirts of Narvik from the northeast. French foreign legionnaires and chasseurs alpins fought their way through the western approaches. Polish soldiers, hungry for revenge against the Germans who had invaded their homeland, attacked with particular determination. Naval gunfire from offshore warships added to the devastation. British and French cruisers and destroyers fired hundreds of shells into German positions, the heavy naval guns tearing apart buildings and fortifications. The din of battle echoed off the surrounding mountains, smoke and dust rising into the clear Arctic air. By the morning of May 28th, German resistance in Narvik itself was crumbling. General Dietl, recognizing that the town could no longer be held, ordered a withdrawal to positions in the mountains to the east. German troops pulled back through the ruins of Narvik, carrying what equipment they could, helping their wounded fighting rearguard actions to cover the retreat. At 1 p.m. on May 28, 1940, Norwegian forces entered the center of Narvik. The Norwegian flag was raised over the town hall, a powerful symbol of resistance and a moment of joy for Norwegian forces who had fought so hard for this victory. For the first time in the war, the Allies had recaptured a significant piece of territory from the Germans. It was a momentous achievement, a validation of the fighting quality of the Norwegian, French, and Polish forces that had fought for this result. But even as Norwegian soldiers celebrated in the ruins of Narvik, the orders for evacuation were already being prepared. The disaster in France had made the decision inevitable. Britain and France could not sustain forces in Norway while the decisive battle of the war was being fought in France and the Low Countries. The expeditionary force in Norway would have to be withdrawn. The evacuation, codenamed Operation Alphabet, began almost immediately. Allied forces began pulling back from their forward positions. Equipment that couldn't be evacuated was destroyed. The port at Narvik and the ore loading facilities were systematically demolished to deny them to the Germans. The ore railway was sabotaged. For the Norwegian forces and civilians, the evacuation was a profound betrayal. They had fought alongside the Allies, had taken terrible casualties, had endured weeks of hardship and combat. Norwegian troops had been the first to enter Narvik, fulfilling the promise to reclaim their country from the invaders. And now, just days later, their allies were leaving. General Fleischer and other Norwegian commanders were informed of the evacuation only at the last moment. The bitterness they felt was entirely understandable. Norway would have to continue the fight alone or surrender. The Norwegian government and royal family would be evacuated to Britain, where they would establish a government in exile. But the country itself would remain under German occupation. The evacuation was conducted with remarkable efficiency, given the circumstances. Allied forces were loaded onto transports under cover of darkness and moved out of the fjords. The Royal Navy provided protection against German submarines and air attacks. Thousands of troops were successfully withdrawn, along with much of their equipment. One of the last units to leave was the French 13th Demi Brigade of the Foreign Legion, who had fought so effectively throughout the campaign. As they withdrew, German forces cautiously began reoccupying the positions the Allies had abandoned. General Dietl's forces, battered but unbroken, came down from the mountains and reoccupied Narvik on June 8, 1940. The evacuation itself, while successful in extracting the Allied forces, came with a terrible cost. On June 8th, the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, which had been providing air cover for the evacuation, was caught by the German battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau while sailing back to Britain. The Glorious and her 2 escorting destroyers were sunk with the loss of over 1,500 lives. It was a tragic end to a campaign that had seen much courage but had ultimately failed in its strategic objective. To truly understand the battles of Narvik, we must consider not just the strategic movements and tactical engagements, but the human experience of those who fought there. These were men. Germans, Norwegians, British, French, Polish, fighting in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Imagine, if you will, the experience of a young German mountain trooper, perhaps from Bavaria or Austria, far from home in the Arctic. You've been transported by destroyer to this remote Norwegian port, crammed into a warship not designed to carry so many men. You've witnessed the destruction of your transport fleet, knowing that you are now truly isolated with no possibility of reinforcement or retreat by sea. The mountains around you are beautiful but hostile. Deep snow, bitter cold, the ever-present wind. You dig in, prepare defenses, and wait for the inevitable Allied attack. Your rations are limited, ammunition is precious, every bullet must count. The Allied naval guns offshore can strike at any moment, sending massive shells that explode with terrifying violence. Allied aircraft appear overhead, and you press yourself into whatever cover you can find. At night, the cold is intense, even in late spring, and you huddle with your comrades for warmth. Sleep is difficult, always one ear alert for sounds of attack. When the battle comes, it's fierce and often confused. The terrain limits visibility and makes coordination difficult. You fight alongside men you've trained with, men who've become closer than brothers through shared hardship. Some of them fall, to bullets, to shells, to the simple, brutal reality of combat. You continue fighting because you must, because your orders are to hold, because your comrades depend on you. Now consider the experience of a Norwegian soldier, perhaps a local man from Narvik itself, or from one of the villages around the fjords. The Germans have invaded your country, occupied your town. You've mobilized with your unit, wearing a uniform that may be decades old, carrying a rifle that your father might have carried. The mountains and snow are familiar to you. This is your home, but everything else has changed. You fight to reclaim what is yours. Every meter of ground has meaning. These are places where you've hiked, hunted, lived your life. The Germans in front of you are well trained and well equipped, but they don't know this land as you do. You use that knowledge, moving through terrain that would stop others, appearing where the enemy doesn't expect you. The cold you can handle. You grew up with this weather. But the artillery, the aircraft, these modern weapons of war are terrifying. When Allied forces arrive to support you, you're grateful but also aware that this has become part of a much larger conflict, far beyond the simple desire to defend your homeland. And when those allies eventually leave, the sense of abandonment is profound. Consider, too, the French Foreign Legion soldier, a professional whose motivations for joining the Legion might be complex. Adventure, escape from a past, a sense of duty, or simply the need for employment. You've fought in North Africa, perhaps in Indochina. You're used to harsh conditions, but this Arctic environment is different from anything you've experienced. The assault landing at Bjerkvik is not your first amphibious operation, but every combat landing is a moment of extreme tension and danger. As your landing craft approaches the shore, machine gun fire kicks up sprays of water around you. The man next to you is hit and falls. You reach the beach and move forward, training and instinct taking over. The village ahead is in flames from the preliminary bombardment. You fight from building to building, clearing rooms, dealing with enemy resistance that is stubborn despite being outnumbered. Later, when the orders come to evacuate, you feel the frustration common to all soldiers who achieve an objective only to be ordered to give it up. You've taken casualties to capture this place, and now you're leaving it to the enemy. But you're a professional. You follow orders. You board the transport ship and watch the Norwegian coast recede behind you, wondering if you'll ever return. And finally, consider the British sailor aboard one of the destroyers that fought in the naval battles. The ship is your world, a cramped, noisy, dangerous world that is nevertheless familiar. You've trained for combat, but the reality is far more intense than any training exercise. The sound of your own guns firing is deafening. Enemy shells scream overhead or explode in the water nearby, sending up huge columns of spray. When your ship is hit, the experience is nightmarish. The explosion, the smoke, the screaming of wounded men, the smell of burning oil and cordite. The ship lists, and you wonder if she'll sink. Damage control parties work frantically to save her while the battle continues around you. If your ship does sink, you find yourself in the freezing water of the fjord, swimming toward shore or hoping to be picked up before hypothermia sets in. These human experiences, multiplied across thousands of individuals on all sides, are what truly constitute the Battles of Narvik. The strategic considerations, the tactical maneuvers, the movements shown on maps, all of these are important for understanding the campaign. But it was individual human beings who lived through these events, who fought and suffered and sometimes died in the mountains and fjords of northern Norway in the spring of 1940. The Battles of Narvik provided numerous lessons that would influence military thinking for the remainder of the war and beyond. For naval warfare, the campaign demonstrated both the continued importance of surface ships and the growing threat of air power. The German destroyers had proven that with boldness and surprise, even an inferior naval force could achieve significant results. But they had also proven vulnerable when trapped and faced with superior forces. All 10 destroyers had been destroyed or scuttled. The Royal Navy had demonstrated its continued ability to project power and its willingness to accept risk in support of strategic objectives. The destruction of the German destroyer flotilla was a significant tactical victory. However, the loss of HMS Glorious and her escorts during the evacuation showed that even powerful warships were vulnerable to enemy action, particularly when air cover was inadequate. The campaign had also demonstrated the growing importance of air power in modern warfare. German air superiority over the battlefield had been a constant problem for the Allies. Without adequate fighter cover, Allied ships and ground forces were vulnerable to Luftwaffe attack. This lesson would be driven home again and again throughout the war, but it was already apparent at Narvik. For ground warfare, the campaign reinforced the importance of combined arms operations and the challenges of fighting in difficult terrain with extended supply lines. The German mountain troops had proven that well-trained, motivated forces could hold out for extended periods, even when outnumbered and isolated, provided they had defensible terrain and competent leadership. General Dietl's defense of Narvik had been a remarkable feat of military leadership and endurance. The Allied forces had learned painful lessons about the need for proper planning and preparation for operations in extreme environments. The initial Allied landings had been somewhat haphazard, with units landing without proper equipment for Arctic operations, without adequate communications, and without clear plans for how they would be supported and supplied. These problems had been gradually overcome, but they had slowed the Allied advance and contributed to the length of the campaign. The importance of local knowledge and specialized training had been demonstrated repeatedly. Norwegian forces fighting in their home terrain had often performed better than Allied units with superior equipment but less familiarity with Arctic conditions. The German mountain troops and French chasseurs alpins, both specialized for mountain warfare, had proven more effective than regular infantry units in this environment. Beyond the purely military lessons, the Battles of Narvik had significant political and strategic consequences. For Norway, the campaign marked the beginning of a 5-year occupation that would not end until Germany's defeat in 1945. The Norwegian government in exile in London would continue to represent Norwegian interests, and Norwegian forces would continue to fight alongside the Allies, but the country itself would suffer under Nazi rule. The campaign had also consumed resources that both sides could ill afford. Germany had lost 10 destroyers, nearly half its entire destroyer fleet at the time, along with numerous submarines and other vessels. The Kriegsmarine would never fully recover from these losses, which would affect German naval operations for the remainder of the war. The loss of trained naval personnel was equally significant and irreplaceable. For Britain and France, the campaign had tied up significant military resources at a critical time. The forces eventually committed to Norway. Several divisions worth of troops, numerous warships, substantial air assets had been drawn from the limited reserves available to the Allies. When the German offensive in the west began, these forces were far away in Norway rather than available to counter the German breakthrough. The evacuation of Allied forces from Norway coming so soon after the hard-won recapture of Narvik had a significant political impact in Britain. The campaign was seen as a failure despite the tactical successes. This contributed to the political crisis that led to the resignation of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his replacement by Winston Churchill in May 1940. Ironically, Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, had been one of the architects of the Norwegian campaign, but he successfully positioned himself as the leader who would fight on despite setbacks. For Germany, the capture and retention of Narvik, despite the heavy naval losses, was seen as a strategic success. The iron ore supply from Sweden through Narvik was secured for the remainder of the war. Hitler's bold gamble in invading Norway had paid off, despite the costs. The Wehrmacht's reputation for bold, successful operations was enhanced, contributing to the aura of invincibility that German forces enjoyed in the early years of the war. While the Battles of Narvik were the most significant and dramatic engagements of the Norwegian campaign, they were only part of a broader picture. Across the rest of Norway, German forces had succeeded in capturing all the major ports and cities. Oslo had fallen on the first day, though the sinking of the heavy cruiser Blücher by Norwegian coastal defenses had delayed the capture and allowed the Norwegian government to escape. Trondheim, Stavanger, Bergen, and Kristiansand had all been occupied. Allied efforts to recapture these southern ports had largely failed. Attempts to land forces at Trondheim had been abandoned after preliminary operations showed the difficulty of the task. The campaign at Åndalsnes and Namsos, designed to pinch out German forces between these two ports and threaten Trondheim from the land side, had been forced to withdraw after coming under heavy German air attack and pressure from German ground forces. Only in the far north at Narvik had the Allies achieved any significant success. And even that success had been temporary. When the evacuation came, Germany controlled all of Norway, a situation that would persist for 5 years until German surrender in 1945. The occupation of Norway gave Germany significant strategic advantages. It provided bases for the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe that threatened Allied shipping in the North Atlantic. German submarines operating from Norwegian ports could range far into the Atlantic to attack convoys carrying supplies from America to Britain. German surface raiders and battleships could use Norwegian fjords as secure anchorages from which to sortie against Allied shipping. The occupation also required the Allies to consider the threat of German forces based in Norway in all their strategic planning. Convoys to the Soviet Union once Germany invaded the USSR in 1941 had to pass along the Norwegian coast and were subject to attack from German air, sea, and submarine forces operating from Norwegian bases. These convoys, particularly those to Murmansk and Archangel, would suffer terrible losses throughout the war. For Norway itself, the occupation was a tragedy. The country was subjected to Nazi rule with all that entailed. Norwegian resistance movements would gradually organize and conduct sabotage operations against the occupiers, most famously the commando raids against heavy water facilities at Vemork that were part of Germany's nuclear weapons program. But resistance came at a terrible cost, and Norway would not be free again until May 1945. In the decades since 1940, the Battles of Narvik have occupied a particular place in the memory of the nations involved. For Norway, they represent both the tragedy of invasion and occupation, and the determination to resist. Norwegian forces fought with courage and skill, and they achieved the distinction of being the first Allied forces to recapture territory from the Germans in World War II, even if that success was temporary. For Britain, Narvik is remembered as part of the larger story of the dark days of 1940, the period when Britain stood largely alone against Nazi Germany. The naval victories are remembered as examples of the Royal Navy's fighting spirit, particularly the actions of Captain Warburton Lee and his destroyer flotilla. The evacuation is remembered as another in the series of withdrawals that marked 1940, along with Dunkirk and the evacuations from Greece and Crete that would come later. For France, the campaign is a less prominent memory, overshadowed by the catastrophic defeat in metropolitan France that occurred at the same time. But the performance of French forces at Narvik, particularly the Foreign Legion and the Chasseurs Alpins, demonstrated that French soldiers could fight effectively when properly led and supported, a point of pride in a period otherwise marked by defeat. For Poland, the participation of Polish forces at Narvik was an early example of the continued Polish contribution to the Allied war effort. Polish forces would continue to fight throughout the war. In the Battle of Britain, at Tobruk, at Monte Cassino, at Arnhem, always seeking to contribute to the eventual liberation of their homeland. For Germany, the Narvik campaign is remembered as a demonstration of the fighting quality of German forces, and particularly of the mountain troops. General Dietl became something of a hero in Germany for his defense of Narvik, and the mountain troops' ability to hold out for 2 months while isolated and outnumbered became part of the Wehrmacht's mythology. The campaign also demonstrated the cost of bold operations. The loss of half the destroyer fleet was a severe blow that would hamper German naval operations for years. The physical evidence of the battles has largely faded. The wrecks of the German destroyers lie in the fjords around Narvik, cold water graves that have become sites for technical divers to explore. The fortifications and fighting positions in the mountains have been reclaimed by nature, though occasional artifacts, shell casings, equipment, even the remains of fortifications, can still be found by those who know where to look. The town of Narvik itself was largely destroyed during the fighting and had to be rebuilt after the war. The ore railway still operates, still carrying iron ore from Swedish mines to the port, a reminder of the strategic importance that brought these battles to this remote location. A war museum in Narvik preserves the memory of the campaign and honors those who fought and died there. As we reflect on the battles of Narvik from the perspective of more than 8 decades later, we are struck by both the courage displayed by all sides and the ultimate futility of much of what occurred. Young men, German, Norwegian, British, French, Polish, fought and died in the snow-covered mountains and the dark waters of the fjords for objectives that, in many cases, would prove ephemeral or strategically irrelevant. The German destroyers fought with courage and skill but were destroyed to the last ship. The sailors who crewed them, many of them young men barely out of their teens, perished in the cold waters of the fjord or survived only to spend years in prisoner-of-war camps. The mountain troops they carried fought with remarkable determination but ultimately served a regime whose cause was morally bankrupt and whose ultimate defeat was probably inevitable. The Allied forces who fought to recapture Narvik succeeded in their immediate objective, only to abandon it days later due to strategic necessities elsewhere. Norwegian troops who fought to liberate their country saw their allies withdraw, leaving Norway to years of occupation. French soldiers who fought effectively at Narvik returned home to find their country in the process of collapse and surrender. Yet within this story of ultimate futility there are countless examples of courage, determination, and human resilience. Captain Warburton Lee leading his destroyers into an enemy-held harbor against superior forces, knowing the risks, but accepting them in pursuit of his mission. General Dietl and his mountain troops holding out for months while isolated and outnumbered, never giving up despite the impossible odds. General Fleischer and his Norwegian forces fighting to reclaim their homeland, achieving that goal even if only temporarily. The French and Polish soldiers who fought far from their homelands, continuing the fight against fascism even as their own countries fell to the Nazi onslaught. The British sailors who fought in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, maintaining the naval supremacy that would ultimately prove crucial to Allied victory. All of these men demonstrated the best qualities of courage and determination even in a campaign that would end in strategic failure. Throughout our exploration of these battles, we must never forget the extraordinary setting in which they occurred. The fjords and mountains of northern Norway in spring are places of harsh but undeniable beauty. The deep blue-black waters of the fjords reflect the snow-covered peaks that rise sharply from their shores. The light in late April and May as the region transitions from the polar night toward the midnight sun has a unique quality. clear and bright, illuminating a landscape that seems both hostile and beautiful. Imagine standing on the deck of a destroyer as it navigates through these narrow waters, the mountains rising on either side, their peaks disappearing into low clouds. The water is calm, reflecting the sky and the mountains in perfect detail, broken only by the wake of the ship. It's cold. Your breath makes clouds in the air, but the vista is breathtaking. Or imagine being positioned in a defensive position high in the mountains, looking down on the fjords below. The view extends for kilometers, water, mountains, the occasional glimpse of human habitation. At night, if the sky is clear, the northern lights might dance overhead, curtains of green and red light shimmering across the stars. It's beautiful, sublime even, and completely indifferent to the human conflict playing out beneath it. This juxtaposition, the beauty of the natural setting against the violence and destruction of warfare, is one of the most striking aspects of the Battles of Narvik. The fjords that were battlefields are now popular destinations for cruise ships and tourists. The mountains where men fought and died are now sites for hiking and skiing. Nature has reclaimed these spaces as it always does, leaving little visible trace of the events of 1940. The Battles of Narvik also saw several technical innovations and tactical adaptations that deserve mention. The use of destroyers as troop transports by the Germans was an unusual and risky decision, but it proved successful in getting the mountain troops to Narvik rapidly. The destroyers were not designed for this role, and the troops they carried had limited heavy equipment as a result. But the speed of the operation achieved strategic surprise. The Royal Navy's aggressive tactics in both naval battles demonstrated a willingness to accept risk in pursuit of strategic objectives. The decision to send destroyers into narrow enemy-controlled waters to attack superior forces, in terms of numbers though not necessarily firepower or training, was bold. The later decision to send a battleship up the confined waters of the fjord was also unusual. Battleships were valuable assets that were normally kept away from waters where they could be vulnerable to submarines or shore-based threats. The sinking of U-64 by a Swordfish float plane launched from HMS Warspite was a notable first, and demonstrated the potential of aircraft in anti-submarine warfare. This presaged the later development of escort carriers and more sophisticated anti-submarine aircraft that would prove crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic. The campaign also demonstrated the continuing importance of artillery, both naval and land-based, in modern warfare. The naval gunfire support provided by Allied warships was crucial to Allied success in ground operations. The ability to call in fire from cruisers and destroyers offshore gave Allied ground forces a significant advantage, particularly in the final assault on Narvik. The use of mountain troops by both sides, German mountain troops and French chasseurs alpins, demonstrated the value of specialized training for warfare in difficult terrain. These units consistently performed better than regular infantry in the harsh conditions around Narvik, demonstrating that specialized training and equipment paid dividends in operational effectiveness. No account of the Battles of Narvik would be complete without a thorough consideration of the weather, which was a constant factor affecting all operations. In April and May in northern Norway, the weather can be highly variable and often severe, Snow squalls can reduce visibility to near zero in minutes. Strong winds can make naval operations dangerous and landing operations impossible. Cold temperatures, even in late spring, can cause frostbite and hypothermia. The weather affected operations in numerous ways. Naval engagements were sometimes fought in limited visibility due to snow or fog, making gunnery difficult and adding to the confusion of battle. Air operations by both sides were frequently canceled or reduced in effectiveness due to weather conditions. Ground operations were slowed by deep snow and difficult visibility. For the troops on the ground, the weather was a constant challenge. Keeping warm was a daily struggle. Wet clothing from snow could lead to hypothermia. Frostbite was a constant risk for anyone who had to remain stationary in defensive positions for extended periods. The Germans, who had planned for a quick operation and had not anticipated a prolonged campaign, were particularly affected by supply shortages that included inadequate winter clothing. Yet the weather also provided opportunities. Snow squalls could provide cover for troop movements or small unit attacks. The long twilight of the Arctic spring meant that operations could continue later into the evening than would be possible at lower latitudes. The relatively stable temperatures, below freezing but not extreme, meant that with proper equipment and preparation, troops could operate effectively in these conditions. The local Norwegian forces, accustomed to these conditions from birth, had a significant advantage. They knew how to dress for the cold, how to move through deep snow, how to read the weather and anticipate changes. This local knowledge was a force multiplier that partially compensated for their inferior equipment and numbers. The campaign at Narvik also highlighted the crucial importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in modern warfare. The German invasion of Norway achieved strategic surprise in part because of excellent operational security. The Allies knew something was happening but were not certain of the scope or objectives of German operations until the invasion was actually underway. At the tactical level, both sides struggled with the challenge of obtaining accurate intelligence about enemy positions and strengths. The terrain around Narvik, with its mountains and fjords, made traditional reconnaissance difficult. Visual observation from a distance was often impossible due to terrain and weather. Air reconnaissance was limited by weather conditions and, on the Allied side, by German air superiority. This lack of reliable intelligence led to several notable incidents. Captain Warburton Lee's attack on April 10th was based on intelligence suggesting 6 German destroyers were in Narvik, when in fact there were 10 in the area. This intelligence failure nearly proved disastrous when the 5 missing destroyers intercepted the British force during their withdrawal. Both sides used Norwegian civilians as sources of intelligence with varying degrees of success. Some Norwegians provided information to the Allies willingly, eager to help drive out the invaders. Others, either sympathetic to the Germans or simply intimidated by them, provided information to the German forces. Still others refused to provide information to either side, determined to remain neutral even after their country's neutrality had been violated. The role of Norwegian pilots and fishermen in providing intelligence to both the Norwegian forces and the Allies was significant. These men knew the waters and could move relatively freely, observing German positions and movements and reporting back. This local knowledge network was informal but effective, providing commanders with information they could not obtain through more conventional reconnaissance means. Behind all the dramatic naval battles and ground engagements lay the unglamorous but absolutely crucial matter of logistics. The campaign at Narvik was, in many ways, a contest of supply lines and logistical capabilities as much as it was a test of fighting quality and tactical skill. For the Germans, the logistical situation was always precarious. The destruction of their destroyer flotilla meant they had no secure sea line of communication to Narvik. Supply had to come either by air, difficult and limited in capacity, or overland from southern Norway, which required moving supplies hundreds of kilometers through difficult terrain and past Norwegian and Allied forces. General Dietl's forces were chronically short of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and other necessities. The Germans adapted by capturing Allied supply dumps when possible, by raiding Norwegian stocks, and by making do with whatever they had. The mountain troops' training and discipline allowed them to function effectively even under these difficult logistical constraints, but it was a constant struggle. For the Allies, logistics was initially chaotic but gradually improved. The port facilities at Harstad were limited, requiring careful scheduling of ship arrivals and unloading operations. The lack of a good road network meant that supplies had to be moved by sea to forward areas, exposing shipping to German air attack. The harsh weather meant that operations had to be planned around weather windows, and even then conditions could deteriorate rapidly. The multinational nature of the Allied force added to logistical complexity. British, French, Norwegian, and Polish forces all had different equipment, different ammunition types, different ration scales. Coordinating supply operations to ensure each national contingent received the right supplies at the right time was a significant challenge. One often overlooked aspect of logistics in this campaign was the management of casualties. Wounded men had to be evacuated from forward areas, often through difficult terrain or by ship under threat of air attack, to medical facilities at Harstad or even back to Britain. The medical personnel who worked in these conditions, often in improvised facilities with limited supplies, performed remarkable work under difficult circumstances. The campaign at Narvik provides numerous examples of both effective and ineffective military leadership at various levels. At the tactical level, we see examples of exceptional leadership. Captain Warburton Lee's aggressive attack, General Dietl's determined defense, General Fleischer's effective use of Norwegian forces. These were leaders who understood their missions, made decisive decisions despite uncertainty, and inspired their men to perform effectively under difficult conditions. At the operational level, the picture is more mixed. The Allied operational command was complicated by the multinational nature of the force and by divided command arrangements. The British, French, and Norwegian forces all had their own commanders, and coordinating actions between these forces was often difficult. The British commander, General Claude Auchinleck, who arrived to take overall command in May, faced the challenging task of coordinating these diverse forces while also dealing with interference from London. The German operational command was simpler in structure but had its own challenges. General Dietl nominally commanded all German forces in the Narvik area. but he was geographically isolated from higher command and had to make many decisions on his own initiative. The German high command, consumed by planning and executing operations elsewhere, could provide little practical support to the forces at Narvik beyond moral encouragement and the occasional air supply drop. At the strategic level, both sides made decisions that, in retrospect, appear questionable. The German decision to commit nearly half their destroyer fleet to the Narvik operation, while bold and ultimately successful in achieving the initial objective, came at a tremendous cost that would hamper German naval operations for years. The Allied decision to commit significant forces to the Norwegian campaign just as the main German offensive in the West was being launched proved strategically unsound, though this was not apparent at the time the initial deployments were made. The political level of command, Hitler's insistence that Narvik be held at all costs, the British and French governments' decisions to first commit to and then evacuate from the Norwegian campaign, demonstrated the complex interaction between political and military considerations in modern warfare. Military commanders could give their professional advice, but ultimate decisions rested with political leaders who had to consider factors beyond purely military ones. The Battles of Narvik, though geographically focused on a small area of northern Norway, had international dimensions that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The campaign demonstrated how the Second World War was already becoming a truly global conflict, with forces from numerous nations converging on this remote Arctic location. The German forces, while predominantly German, included Austrians in the mountain units and drew on military traditions from across the German-speaking world. The multinational nature of the Nazi regime's armed forces, while perhaps not as diverse as that of the Allies, was nonetheless significant. The Allied forces were explicitly multinational. British forces included troops from across the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. French forces included not only troops from metropolitan France, but also the cosmopolitan mix that made up the Foreign Legion, with soldiers from dozens of countries serving in its ranks. Polish forces fighting under their own flag despite their country's occupation represented the determination of an entire nation to continue the struggle. Norwegian forces represented the sovereign nation that was fighting to defend its independence. The presence of Norwegian troops fighting alongside the Allies was politically significant, legitimizing the Allied intervention and making clear that this was not simply a great power contest fought on Norwegian soil, but a fight for Norwegian sovereignty. Even neutral nations played a role. Sweden, though officially neutral, was deeply affected by the campaign. The iron ore that was the ultimate strategic objective of the campaign came from Swedish mines. Swedish territory provided the land bridge over which that ore had to travel to reach Narvik. Sweden's maintenance of neutrality, which meant continuing to supply iron ore to Germany, was a pragmatic decision driven by Sweden's vulnerable geographic position between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, though not directly involved in the Norwegian campaign, was very much a factor in the strategic calculations of all parties. The recent winter war between the USSR and Finland had demonstrated Soviet willingness to use force to secure what it viewed as strategic necessities. Both Germany and the Western Allies had to consider how their actions in Scandinavia might affect Soviet attitudes and actions. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939 was still in effect, meaning that Germany and the USSR were, bizarrely, in a state of formal cooperation, even as they eyed each other with suspicion. The United States, though still neutral in 1940, was watching events in Norway closely. American public opinion, while still largely isolationist, was gradually shifting toward greater sympathy for the Allied cause. The German invasion of Norway, like the earlier invasion of Poland, helped to shift American perceptions of the war and the nature of Nazi Germany. While much of our account has necessarily focused on the military aspects of the campaign, we must not forget the civilians caught up in these events. The population of Narvik in 1940 was several thousand people. Workers for the ore railway, fishermen, shopkeepers, families with deep roots in the region. For these people, the German invasion and the subsequent battles transformed their lives in profound ways. The initial German occupation was likely bewildering. Foreign soldiers speaking an incomprehensible language suddenly controlled the town. The fighting between Norwegian and German forces, and then the naval battles in the fjord, brought the violence of modern warfare directly to a place that had been peaceful. The sound of naval gunfire, the explosions of shells and torpedoes, the sight of ships burning in the harbor, these were traumatic experiences for people who had no experience of war. As the campaign progressed and Allied forces began their offensive, civilians found themselves in the middle of a battlefield. The bombing and shelling that preceded the final assault on Narvik destroyed much of the town. Civilians had to shelter as best they could, often in basements or outside the town in whatever cover they could find. Many lost their homes and possessions to the fighting. The recapture of Narvik by Allied forces on May 28th must have been a moment of joy for many residents. But it was short-lived. The news that Allied forces were evacuating coming so soon after liberation must have been crushing. And then the Germans returned, reoccupying a town that had been devastated by the fighting. For the remainder of the war, Narvik's civilians lived under German occupation. Some collaborated, either from conviction or from the practical necessity of getting along with the occupying forces. Others resisted in ways large and small, from providing intelligence to resistance movements to simple acts of non-cooperation. Many just tried to survive, to protect their families, to maintain some semblance of normal life in abnormal circumstances. The ore railway continued to operate throughout the occupation, with Norwegian workers loading Swedish iron ore onto ships bound for Germany. For these workers, this was both employment that allowed them to feed their families and collaboration with the enemy's war effort. A moral complexity that must have weighed heavily on many. As we come to the end of our long exploration of the Battles of Narvik, we might ask ourselves, what does it all mean? What significance do these engagements, fought so long ago in such a remote location, hold for us today? On one level, the battles were strategically significant. They were part of the larger campaign for control of Norway, which in turn was part of the struggle for control of Northern Europe and the Atlantic. The iron ore that flowed through Narvik was genuinely important to the German war effort, and the Allied attempt to interdict it was strategically sound, even if ultimately unsuccessful. On another level, the battles demonstrated important military lessons about naval warfare, combined operations, logistics, and the challenges of fighting in extreme environments. These lessons would influence military operations for the remainder of the war and continue to be studied in military academies today. But perhaps the most enduring significance of Narvik lies in the human stories it encompasses. Stories of courage and sacrifice, of determination in the face of overwhelming odds, of young men fighting and dying far from home for causes they believed in or simply because duty demanded it. The destroyer captains who led their ships into enemy-controlled waters knowing the risks demonstrate the kind of courage and sense of duty that has always characterized military service at its best. The mountain troops who held out for months while isolated and outnumbered show us human resilience and determination. The Norwegian soldiers who fought to reclaim their homeland remind us that some things, freedom, sovereignty, home, are worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible. The French and Polish soldiers who continued fighting even as their own homelands fell to Nazi occupation demonstrate that courage is not simply a function of national power or military advantage. The British sailors who fought in the cold waters of the North Atlantic were part of a tradition of naval service that helped preserve Britons to continue the war during its darkest hours. And the civilians caught up in these events, Norwegian families whose lives were transformed by invasion, occupation, and warfare, remind us that war's impact extends far beyond the battlefield. That military campaigns have human costs that can't be measured simply in terms of casualties and material losses. The Battles of Narvik took place in a stunning natural setting, the fjords and mountains of northern Norway in spring, a place of harsh beauty where the midnight sun illuminates a landscape that seems almost otherworldly. Today, those same fjords and mountains are places of peace, visited by tourists seeking natural beauty and outdoor adventure. The warships that fought there have largely rusted away or been salvaged, though a few wrecks remain as memorials. The town of Narvik has been rebuilt and continues as a functioning port, still shipping iron ore from Swedish mines to customers around the world. But if we listen carefully, if we allow ourselves to imagine, we can still hear the echoes of those events from spring 1940. The roar of naval guns firing, the crack of rifles in the mountains, the sound of aircraft overhead, the voices of young men calling to each other in German, Norwegian, English, French, Polish. All these echoes remain faint but present part of the history of that place. The Battles of Narvik were part of a larger war that would consume millions of lives before it ended. They were, in the grand scheme of that conflict, a relatively minor campaign. A few weeks of fighting, several thousand casualties, no decisive strategic impact on the war's ultimate outcome. Yet for the men who fought there, for the families who lost loved ones, for the civilians whose lives were transformed, these battles were anything but minor. They were profound, life-changing events that would be remembered for the rest of their lives and passed down through family stories to subsequent generations. As we sit here, comfortable and safe, far removed from those events in both time and circumstance, we can reflect on what those men experienced. We can honor their courage without glorifying war. We can recognize the strategic and tactical aspects of the campaign while never forgetting the human cost. We can study the battles for the lessons they teach while remembering that behind every tactical decision, every movement shown on a map, every casualty statistic, there were individual human beings, men with names and families, with hopes and fears, with lives that were forever changed or ended by these events. The fjords around Narvik are quiet now. The mountains stand as they always have, indifferent to human conflicts. The midnight sun still illuminates the landscape in late spring, creating that unique Arctic light that makes the scene appear almost dreamlike. Ships still sail through these waters, though now they carry tourists and cargo rather than warriors. The ore railway still runs, carrying iron ore to the port, a reminder of the economic reality that brought war to this remote place. But the memory remains, in museums and memorials, in family stories and historical accounts, in the wrecks that still lie on the bottom of the fjords. The battles of Narvik are remembered. They remind us of a time when young men from many nations converged on this remote corner of the world, fought with courage and determination, and became part of history. As we conclude our journey through these events, let us take a moment to honor all those who fought in these battles: German, Norwegian, British, French, Polish, and to remember the civilians whose lives were caught up in events beyond their control. Let us recognize their courage, their sacrifice, and their common humanity. And let us hope that the lessons learned from these battles, and from the war of which they were a part, will help future generations avoid such conflicts. The story of the battles of Narvik is ultimately a human story, one of courage and fear, determination and despair, victory and defeat, sacrifice and survival. It is a story worth remembering, worth studying, worth passing on to future generations, not because war is glorious, but because human behavior in extreme circumstances reveals something profound about who we are and what we are capable of, both at our best and at our worst. Thank you for joining me on this detailed exploration of the battles of Narvik. May the memory of those who fought and died in those cold waters and snowy mountains be preserved, and may we learn from their experiences to build a more peaceful world.